Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. As you probably heard from the news reports, a disease called highly pathogenic avian influenza affected poultry farms in 16 Midwestern and Western states last year. As a result, an estimated 50 million infected birds were slaughtered. To be clear, there have been no human cases of this avian influenza, but domestic poultry are highly susceptible to the virus because it spreads rapidly from bird to bird. Well, now comes word from infectious disease experts that the virus is expected to impact the East Coast this fall or in the spring of 2016. Vermont's Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets is raising awareness of avian influenza and is asking bird owners to pay attention, whether it's a small backyard flock or a large-scale commercial operation. To find out more, I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Haas, the state veterinarian with the Agency of Agriculture. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
What's the main message that you want to share with Vermonters about the highly pathogenic avian influenza?
The main message is a message of unity and the fact that Vermont and our state is only as protected as the least diligent poultry owner. And it's important to remember that this disease, as far as it's concerned, a chicken is a chicken is a chicken, or a turkey, same way, and it doesn't discriminate between large versus small or other stereotypes that we often put on different types of operations. So if you have poultry, this is something that potentially can impact you, and being diligent about your preparedness is of the utmost importance.
So if you have 3 birds in your backyard right now and you're listening to us, you need to be concerned about this.
You need to be concerned about it, not to the extent of being petrified, but to the extent of being concerned enough that you are proactive in educating yourself about what this means for your birds, what this means for our local economy and the production industry in our state, and then most importantly, easy, proactive measures that you can take to protect all of this.
So where does this bird flu come from?
So this particular type of infection is maintained in the natural environment, generally in migratory waterfowl. So they can be infected with the virus and not show signs of illness, and then their migration and other activities can expose our domestic poultry. And I think that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because people think, well, what in the world can I do about wild birds? We can't control that issue, and that's true.
Right.
And even though that's one of the ways that the virus can be introduced to the domestic poultry, there are definitely steps on farms that producers can take to prevent that introduction and spread.
And so how does the flu spread between states?
Well, it's not so much that it spreads between states as it is that it spreads between farms. So if people are moving their birds from one farm to another, whether it's within Vermont or from Vermont to New Hampshire or anywhere else, then there can be spread that way if those birds are infected. And then also, again, this indirect route. So the wild birds, if they come in direct contact with poultry, that can be a problem if the wild birds are infected. And if they indirectly impact poultry, and usually that's through their poop. And the birds become exposed to that and can become infected.
And because this is a time when birds migrate, this is a particularly sensitive time.
It is. And that's why we're taking this opportunity to raise awareness about this. I think that the messages that we're trying to share with people are, it's not rocket science. It's good common sense, and they're practices that people should be following every day. But human nature is that we get complacent. I include myself in that category. And when nothing's happening, we sort of become lax in our practices. And so this is a good reminder about the importance of being diligent.
Now, do wild birds get sick and die from this?
Generally, no.
Mm-hmm. So that's why if you were to see birds dropping out of the sky, then obviously.
Well, that would be right. A whole different story. But with this particular virus, the wild birds that have been found to be carrying it are living quite nice lives and going about their business normally.
And so what are you telling bird owners?
So we are we're asking bird owners to pay attention to the concept of what's called biosecurity on their farms. And that may sound like a little bit of a scary word, but it actually should for everybody have a positive connotation, and it refers to a series of preventative measures. So paying attention to the cleanliness on your farm or in the area where your birds are kept, keeping your equipment, watering and feeding equipment, as well as the environment cleaned out appropriately, making sure that you wear washable boots or booties, foot covers, and that you don't share that clothing or equipment from farm to farm. It's like any other, it's like a kid in kindergarten. You go to school, you are exposed to other children, and that proximity increases the chance of infection. So being diligent about that hygiene is important.
Now, you've helped develop a producer preparedness form, which you're asking bird owners to fill out. What do bird owners need to do and why?
So the producer preparedness form is important for us, and people should perceive it as being important for them too. And what we're asking folks to do is, if they have birds, and like you mentioned earlier, even if it's a couple chickens or turkeys or other domestic poultry in their backyard that they raise for egg production, etc., they still should be completing this form. And the reason is a couple-fold. One, we don't have a comprehensive outreach list to be able to disseminate accurate, useful information to poultry owners. So by providing us with your email address and your contact information, we can do a better job of keeping folks prepared in Vermont. The other reason that it is important is because if we are unfortunate enough to be faced with the infection here in the state, we would use the information provided in those forms to hopefully enable people within that are in close proximity to an infected farm to continue to go about their day-to-day business and carry out their practices on their farm. It's important to note that this form, it's long.
And yeah, it's 15 pages, and it includes a lot of information that people may not think would be pertinent. What fly control's been used, have wild birds been seen in the area or in the house, that kind of thing. But this is all critical information for the state to have to, nip whatever outbreak that might happen kind of in the bud.
Correct. Yep. And what we would urge people to do is, again, if they have poultry in any size, shape, or form, to have a look at this form, to complete it. If there are pieces in the form that don't apply to their operation, then leave it blank. That's fine. Or maybe write NA or not applicable. But definitely complete the pieces that are applicable, because again, it will help speed up our ability to respond to the disease. And the sooner, if we are faced with this, the sooner that we can get out from under it means the sooner that we will be out of people's business and what goes on in their farms.
Let's talk a little bit about maybe worst case scenario. There is an outbreak someplace in Vermont. What happens then? I mean, this is going to affect not just the farm.
Right. So there are federal protocols for how this disease is mitigated. And the reason for that is because the presence of this disease in our country has implications that spread globally. And so if there is an infection here in Vermont, then the farm or the property that is infected has one set of protocols that are completed, and we basically establish what's called a control area or a quarantine area that extends for about a 6-mile radius around that infected farm. So every farm with poultry, again, whether it's backyard or commercial or a few chickens, every property in that control area with poultry is potentially going to be impacted. So there are activities that happen on the infected property, and then there is a separate set of activities that happen in that control area.
And that can affect things like traffic.
Yep. So that's the interesting thing. The outbreak in the Midwest that we have experienced starting back in December of 2014, the demographics of their industry it's very different. So they often have large, what I would call mono operations, where there are 1 million laying hens, for instance, and that's it. Versus here in the Northeast, in New England and Vermont in particular, we have a huge number of diversified, sustainable farms, and so there are multiple species of animals, multiple types of production on a particular farm, and it's important for people to realize that if they do have poultry, then even those other operations on the farm can be impacted. So
vegetables, meats.
Vegetables, yep. We've had conversations with the dairy industry about milk movement and milk pickup on the farms. We've also talked with the feed industry. So if you have animals, oftentimes you're having feed delivered to your property. So adjusting those routes to stay away from infected farms, as well as taking measures to make sure that those movements from farm to farm are not inadvertently spreading the disease.
So are there additional proactive steps that you're asking commercial producers, poultry producers, to take?
Yes, there are. And again, it's probably common sense, but it bears repeating to make sure everybody's on the same page. First and foremost, we want to recognize that the commercial producers we have in Vermont, have potentially the most to lose as a result of this type of an issue. So it is imperative that they are as proactive as possible. So definitely filling out the producer information form, and some of them have already done that and submitted that information to our office. Lots of them have not, so we would encourage that to take place. We would also encourage that they take steps to ensure that their business continuity is protected. It doesn't do anybody any good for us as a state agency or a federal agency to eliminate the disease and in the meantime kill the industry where there's nothing left at the end of it. So taking those steps to protect business continuity, evaluate your property, see where there might be areas that would be acceptable for composting or burial. Talk to your markets to make sure that if we are faced with an outbreak in Vermont or in a neighboring state, that the brand impact isn't significant and that they will still accept your products even when you're not infected.
Right, which is huge.
Business steps that probably people are taking, but if they're not, we want to encourage them to do so.
Which is why it's so important too for someone who just has 1 or 2 chickens, because if they're not following those not drastic kind of moves like a commercial producer, but even just common sense things like keeping an eye on their birds, making sure they're healthy, can actually trigger an outbreak.
Yes, yeah, and we have a lot of hobby poultry owners. It's a popular, nice thing for people to do, to have a couple chickens in their yard to have eggs or to raise them for meat. And so there are a tremendous number of folks out there that fit into that category, and we want them to be diligent and not be afraid to interact with us, because we all should have a common goal of hopefully preventing this, and if we're unlucky enough to deal with it, then mitigating it quickly.
And that can be a good news situation too, because the more people who are watching out for this, the better off we're going to be.
Right.
What are some of the signs that a bird might be sick?
So for better or worse, poultry often show the same set of signs, same signs of illness, regardless of the disease. So it's important to realize that the only way to know for certain whether a bird has avian influenza is to do diagnostic testing, which we do commonly. It involves it's sort of like getting tested for strep throat, a swab in the back of the throat, and then submitting that to the lab. But clinically, the birds can, first of all, look very depressed, lethargic, and kind of out of it. They can lose their appetite. They often show respiratory signs of coughing and discolored combs and wattles. Sometimes they can exhibit neurologic signs, so they can be disoriented or wobbly. And then the other thing that is important to note is that this disease doesn't generally affect just 1 or 2 chickens out of an entire flock. It spreads rapidly, and it will often, usually, infect an entire flock. So you can get, 90% of sick birds or birds that are dying. And sometimes it can hit them quickly enough that they can look normal one day and the next day be pretty badly impacted, if not deceased. If
you notice a chicken in your flock that is not looking well, should they automatically call you?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
And people, owners of poultry, in this state, I know, and every state probably, keep very close watch on their birds, and they know their birds better than we do. So if you are used to experiencing a loss within your flock due to other reasons, and then you notice just more of the same, not a huge deal. But if you notice an unusual number of birds that seem sick, and or any sick bird without a known explanation, anything that doesn't feel right in your gut, we would like to hear from people.
And how can people get in touch with you?
So they can get in touch with us via email, but probably the better way would be to contact our animal health office during regular hours, and that number is 802-828-2421. And if somebody calls after hours, there are instructions to reroute them to an emergency service that can reach me or one of our other state veterinarians.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.